It was supposed to be light and lively, a day made of bright bulbs and playful nerves. The Family Feud board waiting to flip tiles while the audience settled into that comfortable rhythm of claps and laughter that followed Steve Harvey wherever he walked. But something in the air felt curious from the moment Martha Henderson stepped onto the stage. 82 years old in a pale blue cardigan that held its own gentle history, her small silver locket catching a restless wink of light as she moved, with the careful certainty of someone who has decided the time for waiting is finally over. And Steve, who has watched 1,000 families shout out answers and hug each other and bicker with love, who has turned awkward pauses into laughter and nerves into warmth by simply raising an eyebrow, glanced at the woman with a softness that the cameras had learned to follow, because he could sense the way certain hosts can sense that this stranger had brought something heavier than a survey to his doorstep. The plan, at least on the schedule in the control room, was simple. A short human moment between rounds, Steve talking to a guest from the audience about families and the funny things they do under pressure. A few jokes, a bit of heart, then back to the game. But plans on television are as fragile as breath, and stories, when they are ready, do not ask permission to arrive. They slip their hand into yours and lead you past the bright lights to the place where truth lives. Martha stood at the edge of the podium as if it might be an altar, and whispered to a production assistant who'd clipped a microphone to her cardigan. "No, dear, I'm not nervous. I'm ready." And when she took her place next to Steve, the audience gave the polite, encouraging applause that greets elders who brave a stage not built for them. And Steve gave her his wholehearted attention, the kind with a hush inside it, and said in that familiar velvet gravel of his, "Ms. Martha, you look like somebody who's got a story." And she answered, "I've carried something for 60 years, and it's time." You could feel the laughter lean back in its chair and listen. Steve rested his cue card on the podium and didn't look at it again. The board behind them went dark at the edges, studio lights dialing down to a more intimate hum that said, "We will make room for whatever happens now." He asked her where it began, and she told him about Chicago in 1963, about St. Mary's Hospital where she worked as a young nurse, about crisp white uniforms and the smell of antiseptic, about the way families guarded reputations like heirlooms, and about a girl in a delivery room who was 16, unmarried and terrified. Martha's hands trembled only once as she said, "They told her the baby died," and she swallowed a breath as if it hurt to keep any of it inside another second. "But he didn't die. I held him. I heard him cry." The creak and whir of cameras reframing is something you rarely hear in a bright game show, but you could hear it then, because even the equipment wanted to lean in. Steve didn't crack a joke or reach for the easy way out. He stepped closer, not with the authority of a judge, but with the courtesy of a neighbor, and asked quietly, "Ms. Martha, who told her that?" The words came in pieces, and the pieces found their way together as she talked. The family was prominent, the doctor certain. The instructions delivered to a young nurse who believed she had no power to argue with people who carried the world in their briefcases. "They said it was best," Martha said, crying now without fuss, and I listened. "I wish I hadn't. I wish I had done a braver thing." There was a way Steve's face changed that said a man who made his living in laughter also kept space in his pocket for grief. He placed a hand on the podium and let the silence gather, not as a performance but as respect, and he asked, "Why now?" Martha reached into a worn leather purse she'd kept on the steps near her feet, the kind that seemed older than the carpet on which it rested, and drew out a creased newspaper clipping that looked like it had traveled all these years folded against a heartbeat. "Because 2 years ago," she said, "I found out she never stopped looking for him. She looked till the day she died. 3 years ago." The clipping said as much. The headline, a small flare in black ink about a woman named Catherine, who had hired private investigators and written to agencies and scoured records until breath ran thin. And when Steve read it, his mouth tightened at the edges, not with judgment, but with the simple ache that comes when you imagine a mother's hand searching for a door that will never open. He set the clipping down as if it might bruise under a heavier touch, and he asked, "Ms. Martha, did you ever see the baby again?" She hesitated, her fingers worrying the hem of her cardigan as if trying to rub time back into it. And then she pulled out a second relic, a small Polaroid with the color worn to a soft fog, and the edges tired of being held. "I took this," she said, "the night it happened. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself he was real, that I wasn't going to let him vanish entirely." Steve reached for the photograph, and it was then that everything in him stopped. The hand half extended, the sentence half formed. The face of a man who has spent a lifetime hearing stories suddenly silenced by one that asked him to put down every trick and stand there as a person. He lifted his eyes to the audience, to the row of families waiting to play, to the control room window where shadows moved like worried fish, and he said, not in a showman's voice but in a man's, "Hold up. We need to do this right." There was a ripple of confusion, and then the studio listened to a new kind of stillness, the kind that arrives when something real interrupts the script. Steve stepped to the edge of the stage and called softly for a supervisor, and a woman in a headset rushed over, and their whisper was not secretive but careful. One of those conversations where both people are trying to figure out how to unspool something fragile without breaking it. The supervisor's eyes widened, then steadied, and she disappeared into the backstage dark, speaking into her headset in a tone that pulled other voices to attention. Martha held the photograph against her chest like a relic that could either absolve or accuse, and Steve returned to her with that same gentleness in his face, as if he had set his showman's suit on a chair and put on a different jacket, one with more pockets. "Ms. Martha," he said, "have you tried to confirm any of this?" She nodded. "I hired a private investigator last year. I gave him everything I had. He found him." The sentence slid across the room like a new kind of weather. "He's alive. 60 now. Children, grandchildren. He doesn't know how his life began." There are moments that rearrange a room's architecture without moving a single chair, and this was one. The Family Feud board behind them had never looked more like a simple wall, and the audience had never been more than witnesses with their hands folded. And Steve had never looked more like someone you'd want next to you when truth arrives, trembling and loud. He did something then that some would not expect from a host of a game show, but that anyone who has watched him long enough would have known he'd do. He stepped into the space beyond applause and ratings and said, "We're going to stop the fun for a minute, and we're going to treat this like the life it is." He asked Martha to come with him backstage, and he told the audience in a voice that asked them to walk with him rather than wait for him, that sometimes the game waits because people don't. They disappeared into the hallway where trophies of past seasons stood behind glass, and the crew bent around them like a river. And for a while, the Family Feud stage became a place that held its breath, while another story took the lead. Backstage, speed gathered itself without panic. Legal was called. The investigator reached by a voice that said, "This is urgent, but also this is delicate." The show's research team, who normally confirmed celebrity names and survey sources and the funny, harmless facts that make television glide, shifted to a different gear, asking for access to records tracking down hospital logs, cross-referencing birth dates and adoption notes from an era that had preferred secrets the way certain diners prefer everything fried. It was not easy. It is never easy to unwind 60 years of other people's choices, but it was possible. And possibility poured coffee and kept going. 6 hours later, with the studio reset for the night and the bright letters of the game sleeping softly on the board, the team had what they needed. Confirmation that a baby boy had been born alive to a 16-year-old named Catherine Marie Donovan, that the family had arranged something off the record, that a wealthy couple, the Richardsons, had taken him and raised him as if he had arrived the usual way. His name now was Michael Richardson. He lived in Portland, taught high school, was married, had 3 children and 2 grandchildren. The particulars of his goodness were everywhere in the way a teacher's life leaves gentle prints. Former students who wrote notes, neighbors who nodded, a life built like a chair that holds. Steve looked at the paper that held the facts and then looked at the people in the room and said, quietly, but without any wobble, "We're not making a spectacle out of this man's life. No surprises on television, no ambush. We do this with dignity, or we don't do it at all." He asked for a private line and placed a call that lasted 47 minutes and felt longer. A call in which he introduced himself not as the man with the mustache from TV, but as someone who had heard a difficult truth and wanted to pass it along with as much care as human hands could manage. And on the other end, Michael traveled through disbelief and anger and silence and sorrow, a trail down a mountain in winter, and then, when he could finally shape the words, he asked the only question that mattered: did she want me? And Steve, who has a comedian's gift for timing and a grandfather's gift for comfort, said, "Son, she never stopped." The weeks that followed moved like a new kind of production schedule written in pencil and prayer, not a spectacle or a stunt, but a meeting arranged carefully between two people who had both carried the weight of the same night in different ways. One who had lost a name she had never been allowed to say, and one who had carried a name that had been lovingly given, but not the first one he was owed. The Family Feud stage was cleared for a quieter filming, the audience chairs empty, the applause lights asleep, the podiums rolled to the wings, and in their place were 3 chairs in a wide, soft triangle, Steve in one, Martha and Michael in the others. The cameras framed faces instead of families, the boom mics hung like birds who had agreed to listen, and the silence the room had learned to hold earlier now returned like an old friend who had found his seat. Michael held the Polaroid, his first recorded moment on Earth, and stared at the image that had faded to a dream of pastel skin and shadow, a blur that still, somehow, bore a shape that felt like recognition. "I don't know how to feel," he said, and the sentence was a bridge that could take years to cross. Martha's hands, which had known the tremor of guilt and the steadiness of resolve, reached out halfway and waited, because she had learned that you don't take someone's hand before they offer it. And when Michael took hers, it was less an absolution than a promise that they would figure out how to stand in this new weather together. Steve spoke only when the air asked him to, lending a question here, a nod there, a small joke that flared and dimmed in the same breath to give everyone a place to rest. Martha told Michael about Catherine, her full name, Catherine Marie Donovan, her laugh made shy by the times she lived in, her stubbornness that had looked like grace when she stood up to adults and kept asking for her son, the way she knitted a blanket before he arrived and tucked lavender into the chest where she kept it, because her mother had told her that lavender blessed sleep. She brought the blanket with her, a small square of tenderness that had waited 6 decades for the right pair of hands. Michael lifted it to his face, and grief arrived with the unmistakable scent of love that had crossed an ocean of years without drowning. Steve, as gentle as a hand at the small of the back, said that the team had found relatives of Catherine's who would like to meet him if he wanted, cousins and an aunt who had stories and photographs and names that would no longer be strangers. Michael nodded, tears making no apology, and said he wanted to know the woman who had never been allowed to hold him long enough to memorize his face. The meeting at Catherine's grave happened on a day that knew how to be kind. A cool sky, a breeze that moved through the grass with the sound of turning pages, and a cluster of people who were learning how to be a family in the wide, patient way that grief and grace teach. They brought flowers, photographs, and the knitted blanket, and someone brought a journal, Catherine's, saved by a sister who couldn't let it go, its spine tired, its pages full of the small and holy record of an ordinary, brave life. Michael read entries written in a looping hand that grew surer and then, at the end, a little frail. August 12, 1963. Today you turn 1 month old. I hope you are loved. And decades later, August 12, 2020. Today you turned 57. I am tired, but I'm still looking. I will always be looking. The kind of sentences that do not end when you stop reading them. Steve stood a respectful distance away as the family made a circle of stories, and then asked if he might say something to the camera that had been invited not as a witness to spectacle, but to proof that truth, even late, belongs to all of us a little. He spoke about the worst and best braided into the same rope, a world that had once allowed secrets to be called solutions, and the courage of people who decided, even late, to tell the truth and choose love where silence had been the custom. He did not call for applause. He did not make anyone cheer. He asked the viewers at home to hold their own histories a little more gently, and to look, where they could, for what had been hidden and to bring it into the kind of light that heals. After the episode aired, a quiet special with more heartbeat than showmanship, There were letters and emails and phone calls from people who had their own old envelopes and hidden photographs. Organizations who had been doing the work of reform for years found themselves carrying a brighter torch because this story had taught a crowd to watch the road and see the need. A few states drew up bills that would later wear Catherine's name. Laws that insisted that truth in adoption be chosen first, that mothers and fathers and children be given what belonged to them as a matter of human dignity, rather than legal convenience. And Michael, who had returned to his classroom because teenagers still needed Shakespeare and algebra, and the steady presence of a man who believed in them, stood on days off in state houses and spoke plainly that a boy can love the parents who raised him and still be owed the truth about his beginning, that a woman can make a terrible mistake under pressure and still be brave enough to walk the rest of the way in honesty. Martha, who had steadied herself for an old age of quiet regret, found instead a few years of humble purpose. She started a small foundation that helped pay for searches and records, that put envelopes in the mail to people who might otherwise never have known where to begin. And when she passed away 2 years later, Michael gave the eulogy with his voice breaking and mending in the same breath, saying, "She did something wrong and then she did something right." And somewhere in the mystery of those two things living in the same life, I found my mother again. There was a photograph at the funeral, too. Actually, one of Catherine in her teens with hope on her mouth and worry in her eyes, and one of the Polaroid of the baby, whose first cry had been stolen from his mother and kept alive by the stubborn kindness of a young nurse who didn't know how to be brave yet, but took a picture anyway, as if to say, "One day, this boy will be a man and he will deserve to see his own face." Steve kept a copy of the Polaroid in his office, framed not in gold, but in a simple black border that matched the quiet of the lesson it taught. He said, when asked about it during a retrospective the show did years later, that the Family Feud stage had taught him 1,000 ways people try to win, but that photograph taught him a little more about what it means not to lose what matters, and that sometimes a game show can be a place where a different kind of victory happens when someone chooses the harder good. In the months after the grave visit, Michael met Catherine's family in living rooms where coffee cooled and was heated again, where old recipes were tried and failed and tried again until the taste matched the memory, where names, Aunt Lila, Cousin Sean, Grandma May, became real people who brought him stories like small bowls of water for a traveler, and he in turn brought them stories of his life with the Richardsons, summer camping trips and spelling bee defeats, and a father who taught him to change a tire the same day he taught him to apologize. There was no courtroom of the heart where one set of parents had to be convicted for the other to be loved. There was instead a larger table, and the place cards were written in a hand that had learned how to forgive without forgetting. Sometimes people asked Michael what the hardest part was, and he said it was learning to let the anger be a visitor, not a permanent tenant, because anger had a way of taking up the whole sofa and spilling crumbs everywhere. And sometimes they asked him what the best part was, and he said it was a sentence he could finally say without a knot in it. My mother wanted me. The Family Feud crew, those men and women who had wheeled podiums and aimed lights and learned the science of laughter, kept a quiet memory of the day the show paused to make room for something larger. Newer staff heard the story from older staff, the way rookies learn the rules from veterans, and every now and then a warm-up comic told the audience, before the first question flipped and the first buzzer sang, that on this stage once a grandmother had pulled a photograph out of a purse, and the room had learned what silence could do when it held the truth. Steve did not turn it into a legend. He let it live like a candle on a shelf, something you notice when the room grows dark. He went back to hosting the way a man goes back to work after a funeral. More tender, quicker to call people by their names, more ready to stand between foolishness and harm when the moment asked for it. When viewers wrote in to say that the episode had made them call their mothers or tell their sons something they should have said long ago, he read those letters all the way to the end and then kept them in a drawer that held only the things that mattered. The photograph itself, the first and smallest artifact in the chain, found other lives. It appeared in articles on reform, in folders carried by people who testified, in documentaries that tried to braid statistics into a story without losing the beating heart at the center. It became the face of a movement, not because it was a perfect picture, but because it was a flawed one, a worn and fading square that looked exactly like memory looks when it refuses to let the past vanish. Michael framed his copy and placed it next to a picture of Catherine that her sister had kept for decades. And together the images made a promise, mother and son, not side by side in life, but finally together in the place where love keeps its records. When people asked him, because people always do, what he thought of his appearance on a game show changing the course of his life, he said it hadn't been a show that changed it, but a choice. A grandmother choosing to tell the truth in front of millions when she could have stayed home and let time do the hiding. A host choosing to stop the easy thing and do the right thing. A team choosing to put aside what makes good television for what makes good people. In private, sometimes Michael would unfold the blanket and let his grandchildren touch the lavender ghost of a grandmother they would never meet. And he would tell them that love is stubborn, and that truth is a patient friend who will wait at your front door as long as it needs to if you're too scared to let it in. He would say, and the room would listen because children know when a grown man is telling the truth, that everybody wants to know two things before they are done here, that they were loved and that they mattered. And if someone had asked Steve why he froze that day, why the man whose eyebrows could make an audience laugh without a punchline suddenly put his hand in the air and told the world to stop, he might have said that he saw in a faded photograph not only one stolen baby and one searching mother, but a long hallway of families separated by years and mistakes and laws. And he understood that sometimes the job is not to keep the machine moving, but to climb into it and turn it off so the people inside can hear themselves think. The Family Feud stage would go back to its surveys and its feuds and its hilarity, because the world needs laughter and a place to be silly with the people you love. But it would also carry a small invisible plaque that only shows up when certain kinds of light hit it. The memory of a day when winning meant something else entirely. When an old woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small square of paper that turned a game show into a sanctuary, when silence spoke louder than applause, when truth walked across a glossy floor and took its place at center stage, and nobody, not one soul in that room, asked it to hurry.